Damage per minute within World of Tanks console is very, very important, but it can also completely fool you as to whether or not a tank is actually good, whether the damage per minute is effective, and whether or not it's actually going to impact the game that you are going to have with a tank. So with that out of the way, what do I mean? Well, there are two main things within World of Tanks console that I think DPM has. Two factors that affect it. There is essentially actual DPM and effective DPM, because vehicles like, for example, the Vigilante have a DPM of 6,344. This is way higher than any other vehicle in the game. But then you were to look at, for example, the tank destroyer from the British line, the FV4005. I'm pretty sure we all know that one. This one has a damage per minute of 3,000. But there's a difference between the two tanks, why actually the FV4005 could have technically more damage per minute, and compared to something that literally has nearly double, if not over double, what the DPM of that tank actually is. And so how is that? Well, it all comes down to effective DPM. What is an effective DPM? Well, it comes down to a variety of factors that make up whether a tank is effective versus whether it has a flat DPM that is going to be able to carry the tank into something different. So, for example, the T249 has this minigun. We all know about it, but the core thing is that this isn't a very effective main armament on a vehicle. So 75 penetration, this is significantly lower than pretty much all of the armor that you are going to meet within the game, which means that if you are in a frontal engagement one-on-one with a vehicle and you have 75 penetration and you're dealing 25 damage a shot, you are going to be not dealing any damage. I'm pretty sure we can all agree on that. If you are facing a Type 5 heavy, there is no way you can deal a decent amount of damage. Now, the autocannons do have a way of dealing like a minimal amount of damage, but regardless, say that this tank didn't do any damage if it doesn't pen, it would not be able to do anything. So although this tank has 6,344 DPM, in reality, when we look at it against almost every single frontal vehicle in the game, it has 0. It cannot do anything to those tanks if it didn't do damage when it didn't pen. So that is where things like DPM and statistics can get skewed heavily compared to other vehicles. So, for example, the FV4005, good example, it does 1,150 damage with its AP rounds, 1,450 with its HESH rounds, and 1,650 with its HE, so its actual core HE. But obviously, each of these have different values. So, the penetration on the standard AP rounds, which are your primary armor piercing rounds, things that are going to go through the heaviest armor that you're meeting, have 1,150 damage and 310 pen, which means you can go through most vehicles as long as you're aiming at a weak point, and most of the weak points at 310 pen are the front of vehicles, so you can pretty much pen every single tank that you're meeting with 310 pen and 1,150 damage done. The T249 can't do that, and in fact will end up with 0 damage even if it sits there unlike clipping out something, it's not going to do any damage. So effectively, this has way better DPM, even though the average damage per minute is 3,025. Get my drift? Is that whilst the FE doesn't have the most effective DPM in my opinion, it gives you an idea as to what I'm trying to suggest here, what you need to be analysing when you're looking at vehicles, whether you want to purchase a tank in the future, whether you're deciding to go to a Protect tree, and deciding what kind of damage per minute you enjoy playing. Because it's all well and good having the most highest crazy number of DPM, but if it means that you don't actually get damage in 99% of scenarios, it might not be the tank for you. Obviously, we've got the Badger here. This is what I would call the effective DPM. Now, whilst I don't like the Badger in its entirety because of the fact that it sacrifices almost everything in order to get that DPM, the DPM and effective DPM of this tank is very, very good. Now, why is that? Well, both the standard and APCR rounds of the Badger in particular are very, very high. They have 72 penetration on the standard rounds, which means you can fire that at pretty much every single tier 10 and pen, and 330 with its premium rounds, which have APDS. So these are super fast rounds, decent damage as well, 480 damage, remember. This is a very core thing that I would like to state in a minute. But 330 pen, so you can basically pen absolutely everything from the front in the game, including Mauses, Type 5 heavies, all of the super heavies in the game. Nothing basically has armor when you're facing against the Badger. So the Badger is going to whittle away hit points pretty much every single time it reloads. And that is where the reload comes into effect as well when we're looking at DPM. Because reload is all well and good if you can, every single time that you reload, you're dealing damage. Then yes, that's very good DPM, and you can deal a lot of damage, and provided you're reloading every single time and firing instantly, you're dealing a lot of damage in every single minute that you're playing. But if your reload is too long, what you can find with something like the FV4005, FV215B183, the high alpha TDs, is that maybe a tank comes out, 5 seconds before you're reloaded, and you end up not being able to get a shot then for another 30 seconds. And so because you missed out on that initial opportunity, it gives you an opportunity cost that you wouldn't see with other vehicles in the game. Something like a Badger, which would have been reloaded 100% of the time when you're coming up against a tank that maybe pokes out. And the other thing is that you also then have to factor in, well, what happens if I could track someone? I'm actually aiming for a track and penning shot. What about the reload between that? Am I going to be able to reload before someone repairs their track? Versus am I going to only ever get one shot off and then spend, 2-3 seconds after they repair the track to then have to wait until I get my next shot off? Which means that whilst you may have more damage, so maybe let's say a tank does 600 damage instead of the 480 on the Badger, you might sacrifice the reload speed. So instead of having, what is the Badger right now, 7.33 second reload, what if that tank had 10 seconds of reload? Well, the Badger would be able to track and pen, and then get another shot in to track and pen, and then another one to track and pen. But what happens if the track repair speed of the tank is 9 seconds? And so you are playing a tank that has 600 alpha, but the actual speed of the reload is 11 seconds. Well, you've then got a 2 seconds after the person has repaired their track to then actually fire again. So what can happen is you end up tracking but not getting a second shot of damage off, whereas the Badger would be able to continuously retrack, deal damage, retrack, deal damage, retrack, deal damage, and you get my drift. So you could end up with 5 shots with the Badger but only 1 shot with another vehicle. So whilst I'm not saying the Badger is a good tank, just be aware of that because it sacrifices a lot in order to get the DPM and effective DPM, etc. The actual damage output, like what it states on there in terms of how much damage you're getting, is actually relatively accurate to what you will see in the game, provided you play it like at the perfect level. We're talking about like if you never miss, you never bounce, you're aiming at exactly the right place that you should be. The top tier, like the pinnacle of what you can expect from a vehicle. Obviously, people don't have the best aim, people are newer, people miss, RNG plays a factor as well. And so, provided that you have a good tank with a reasonable reload, so I'm talking usually a tank with really high effective DPM is one that has a decent average damage per minute, has a reload around 5 to 6 seconds because this is typically how long it takes to repair a track. And whilst you might lose some distance where they reverse like for like half a second or something like that, you can then retrack again. And so it's in that range of anywhere from about 4 seconds to 6 seconds. When you start getting under that value, what you can typically find is that the damage that you're dealing every single shot comes down dramatically to maybe 300 damage, 250 damage. And so for every shot you would have to get with a Badger, which can do the exact same thing, retrack, deal damage, retrack, deal damage, you would have to retrack and deal damage like twice. And so it gives more opportunity for you to either get hit by someone and maybe they get lucky, they have a repair kit, they shoot you back and they hit you for double the damage that you're dealing to them. And so you're going to have to try and then retrack an opponent and hit them multiple times for every time that they hit you. So it's finding a fine balance between the two. And so this is something that is kind of abstract from what you would normally expect when we're talking about World of Tanks console. I wanted to go into it because it is important, and how you as a player can get better by simply understanding the statistics, understanding what a tank can do, its limitations, and the sorts of things that you can do to mitigate that. Now, obviously, this also plays a role with accuracy, because you could have a really high DPM, you could have a really good reload, like that perfect range, 4 to 6 seconds-ish. But what happens if your accuracy is 0.5 and you're always missing? Well, the effective DPM comes down massively because you're not able to guarantee that where you're shooting is going to land exactly where you want it. So that is also a factor that you need to account for. If a tank has a laser, has about 5 to 6 second reload, and has 3,500 DPM at tier 10, for example, this tank is probably going to be pretty decent, provided that it has a little bit of mobility and the other things that play into the game. A tank can't simply be amazing based on just one thing, which is DPM. Whilst I do think that is one of the most important things in the game, it also does get impacted by speed, mobility, which also plays into effective DPM. If you're playing a tank like the Badger, the one negative about it is that it's slow, so the effective DPM can be limited because you can't get to the next opponent to keep firing. Whereas you look at a light tank, for example, it might have a lower damage per minute, but it can get to another opponent much quicker than the Badger can by like double, triple, maybe even quadruple, depending on what speed we're talking about when we look at a light tank versus the Badger. And so in that time period, you might wait 40 seconds just to make it to the next opponent that you're going to be facing, and then you might deal a ton of damage to them. But a light tank would have got to the next opponent within 5 seconds, 10 seconds, or whatever. And so that can really change how you view damage per minute, what you have to factor in. So if you can have a tank with decent mobility, good DPM, a decent reload where you can retrack people, decent accuracy, you are in for a winner, which is why we see medium tanks typically working one of the best within the game, because they have okay penetration, they've got all of those things that we've just mentioned, but they're dealing a lot of damage per minute because of that. And so you can have those 10k damage games. The one thing that is kind of an outlier is people see things like the FV4005 and they see people having 11k damage games. Now this can happen, and it's probably more likely for a new player or someone less experienced that they're going to have a higher damage game in a tank like the FV4005 because it has inherently a lower skill cap. You don't need to reposition as much, and in some games, some cases, you will find that people just keep coming out in the open, and as soon as you're reloaded, you fire. Hit as many games as you want, 1,000 games in. One of those games might be where there are just constant streams of enemies running directly in front of your gun, and you're firing every single time that you reload with a massive amount of damage every single shot, and you're going to have a 10k damage game. Compare that to a medium tank, you are going to have to be consistent throughout the entire battles, regardless of your skill level. Even if people cross open, if you're not very good at tracking, retracking, spotting, moving around, it's going to be much harder for you to hit the higher damage ceiling. So whilst people see big alpha means big damage, it's not necessarily indicative of like what you would typically expect, because some people who play an FV4005 might deal 0 damage, or maybe they only find one shot in an entire game where they could actually get a full damaging shot on someone. So whereas a medium would have had multiple opportunities. So the skill cap is much higher, and so the overall damage, average damage that you'll be dealing in something like a medium, provided you have a little bit of skill, will be higher than an FV4005. Even if you see these things occasionally dealing 10k damage, 11k damage, it's usually more of an outlier game and is reliant upon the enemy team making mistakes as opposed to you being good or you being really good at being able to deal damage. Obviously, if you're very good and you're playing this and the enemy team do that, you can have outrageous games. But at the same time, if you are playing in a medium with all of the statistics we've talked about, on average, you're going to deal more damage as a highly skilled player. That's something I wanted to talk about as well. So these are some of the things you need to be thinking about, especially if you're trying to learn the game, get better at the game. And, you know, I could tell you what the best tanks are. I could say this is going to be a really good tank because of this. But if you don't understand the reasoning why, you will not understand and be able to analyze things in your own games, understand why you need to play things in certain ways. You need to learn the core things, the core mechanics of the game, and understand the abstracts so that you can then bring it into your own games and actually get better within World of Tanks, which is something that I think has been lost. A lot of the more older players that would have understood this has kind of gone away through some of the updates and stuff like that that have happened on the game. And so there's a lot of things that you need to consider when looking at vehicles in particular. But this is definitely something that I think is really important to discuss, let you guys know, and hopefully it came across well. I explained it. If you got any questions, any queries, let me know in the comment section down below. But I thought it was important. So thank you, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.